So the session we have today is clarification and necessity of teaching critical race theory and its relationship to poverty. Now that's a tongue twister. That's a lot within itself, but we need it. And our awesome speaker is Marcella Mulhollem. And I believe that I've talked to her a few times this morning. And the person that she is, I know she's going to bring a lot to the table today in this session. So if you have your pads of paper from your check-in bag, I'd say get that out, take some notes, pay attention to the slides and all of what she's going to say. I am going to give you a little bit about what the session is going to be about, and then I will let Marcella take it over. You can ask questions in the app. You can, those of you on virtual, you can ask the questions in Zoom. I will be monitoring both. When Marcella is ready to take questions in the room or even on that from the app or whatnot, she will let me know and I will try to come to you and get the mic. Otherwise, speak loudly so that the people on virtual can hear you, and then Marcella will answer the question, okay? So, good morning again. Critical race theory, CRT, is a body of research springing from the meeting of civil rights activism of the 1970s and academic study. It utilizes race to frame and investigate social constructs and institutions such as education, the justice system, and the creation of social policy. Because CRT challenges the racial equality of the existing social order and accepted history of America by including the perspective and experience of non-whites, it has come under attack as a subversive element meant to undermine American patriotism, weaken the accepted social order, incite social unrest, and divide the nation. As a result, multiple states have moved to ban the teaching of critical race theory, asserting it vilifies whites and victimizes anyone not white. I give to you Marcella Mulhollem.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for being here. And hello also to people who are tuning in virtually today. So she's right. This is a lot. And I'm going to be saying a whole lot in 45 minutes because I do want to try to leave time at the end for questions or comments as well. But basically what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to give you a very quick overview of what critical race theory is. Talk a little bit about the words that are used when we're having these discussions. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the policies that critical race theory is actually concerned with when we talk about history coming forward, and then bring us up to date where we are now. Okay, so first, an introduction. The key figures of critical race theory are these people that you see listed here: Bell, Creshaw, Dagallo, Harris, Lawrence, Matsueda, and Williams. Predominantly, these are legal and law professors in academia. Now, in the introduction, what she said was, this came out of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. More so, to be more specific, what happened was there was all this forward movement that happened in the 60s and 70s. And then when people who were actually academics studying how different policies and changes that had happened then were making way into the 80s and 90s and so on, what they were noticing was that there was a lot that wasn't actually changing, or that was actually kind of reversing. And so they said, we need to stop just assuming that all the work is done. We need to stop assuming that everything was handled and now the ship is righted and we're headed in the right direction. We need to actually look at the elements that are in the bones of the system, so to speak, right? So what I would say, if you are talking about critical race theory, what is it? It is a racial lens. So I'm a sociologist. That's what my degree is in, right? We have something in sociology called the sociological perspective. And what that means is, if you want to understand other people, you want to understand other groups, you want to understand other cultures or something like that, what you have to do is you have to pick up a lens and look through it, their eyes, their experiences, where they've been, their history, their stories. And this allows you to literally, you've heard that, put yourself in someone else's shoes, walk a mile in someone else's shoes. It's this concept. This lens is the exact same thing. If you want to understand the history or story of any group of people, you need to pick up the lens of their life. Critical race theory is picking up a racial lens. And it's saying, okay, I'm going to look at the history and experience of being an American through the lens, the eyes of someone who is African American, specifically. Now, conceivably, this could be applied to any non-white race, right? I'm going to be sticking with primarily African American because that's from which it sprang, and also that's kind of the focus here. But from that came this body of scholarship that these individuals began. In the last 10 years, there's been a whole lot added to that. If you start actually, if you get in and you start, you go to Google Scholar and you start looking up critical race theory and you start looking up, it's in all directions. You can spend days just wandering through all the different topics. So there's a lot of ideas out there that people will say, well, especially when we hear kickback in schools, they're saying, well, we have to teach history as it is. Agreed. But critical race theory isn't exactly just history. It encompasses history. It includes history. But it is literally looking at the policies and the laws that have shaped the history of a people. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, and I'm going to go through just a number of different concepts and words that I'm going to be throwing around so that we're all on the same page, okay? First, prejudice versus racism. I do this a lot in my sociology and inequalities class. We use these words interchangeably, and to some degree they are, but prejudice is the ideas that we have about a people. Prejudice is actually kind of more personal, right? You can have a prejudice against people for any number of reasons. You can have a racial prejudice, you could have a sexist prejudice, you could have, whatever. Prejudice is often, I consider it like an internal experience that we have towards another group of people. And it's based on a presumption that this group of people share all of a certain kind of trait, right? Racism is different. Racism is a hierarchy. It is a structure, right? We often will have this discussion in my class where I'll say, is it possible to be racist against someone who is white? Technically, the answer is no. You can be biased, you could be prejudiced, but you can't be racist. Why? Because white people sit at the top of the economic hierarchy structure. You can't hurt them by saying, oh, you're white. It doesn't do anything. That's why we say, if you ever hear someone say, you can't be racist against whites and you don't know how to answer that, that's what we're talking about, because racism is a hierarchy. It is a social structure. That's the clarification of what we're talking about. Okay. Socioeconomic prejudice. And I'm going to bring this in really quickly because it plays a part. It's different than racism, but it goes hand in hand often. Now, socioeconomic prejudice can be applied to any race, mind you, but we see it show up a lot reinforced in racism. Okay, first, the Puritan work ethic. Anybody ever heard of this? A few of us. Okay, that's great. So the Puritans were a group of people who helped settle America, right? And they really were into two things, God and work. And the Puritan work ethic centers around the relationship between those two things. According to the Puritan work ethic, if you work hard, you will be blessed by God. And there's nothing wrong with that concept in and of itself. If you are a person of faith and you do well and you want to give glory to God, great, that's fine. But when we understand it as, or not even understand it, that's the thing, it's kind of like this thing that we have floating around in the American concept of self, but we don't ever really stop to break it down what that means. Because the converse of that is what? If I am working hard and I am a good person because I am blessed by God, if I don't have, if I am in poverty, if I am poor, if I am not successful, the converse of that is automatically, there must be something wrong with you because you're not being blessed. This is where we get the idea of vilifying the poor. you are lazy, you have a bad work ethic, you aren't intelligent, you're not trying hard enough, right? And this just kind of springs up automatically because we have this idea that if you work hard enough, you're going to do okay. This is also seen, by the way, in criminal justice. It is extremely hard to prosecute white collar crime. Why? We tend to let them get away with it. Well, two reasons. Number one, they normally have the money to get a great lawyer. And the other reason is they're just good people who made a mistake, right? So we see it play out in a number of ways in our policies and systems. But this is kind of like the mindset that we have without even thinking about it. The other one is the bootstrap theory. Anyone know that one? So happy I've got some people who know this stuff. That's great. All right, who knows what a bootstrap is? Anybody? That's exactly right. Yes, ma'am. Agreed. All right, who has ever watched Little House on the Prairie? All right. Wow, I'm dating myself, I guess. Okay, Little House on the Prairie. Pa Engel's walking along. He's got these high boots on, and on the edge of his boots, there are two leather straps on either side. They were used to help pull the boot, literally pull the boot on. Bootstraps, right? When we say pull yourself up by the bootstraps, we are actually telling you to do the impossible. We want you to pick yourself up off the ground by your bootstraps. So the bootstrap theory is, and this is I wouldn't say it's a completely American phenomenon, but we have in our culture, we're very individualistic minded, right? You go out and you find the American dream, you succeed. If you just work hard enough, it's very individualistic, right? So that's this idea. You should be able to pick yourself up by your bootstraps. And this goes hand in hand with this idea that you're not working hard enough. So we have these two things that cause this idea of socioeconomic prejudice, that if you are in dire straits, it must be something to do with you. We do not consider that it could be systematic. We do not consider that the problem could be larger than that. It's just the individual. Okay, labeling. Labeling theory in sociology talks about the power of labels. When we make assumptions about people, two things happen. Number one, we basically push them into the system that I was just talking about, and we say, sink or swim, it's up to you. And number two, if you tell people long enough, we've actually done studies on this, this is really true. If you tell someone long enough that they are not worthy, or they are unintelligent, or they are incompetent, or they're no good, they will eventually believe it. And they'll live up to it, so to speak. So the power of social labels. When we decide, and that goes right back to racism and prejudice, we decide that we already know who someone is or who a group of people are, and we reinforce it without even thinking. All right, institutional or systematic racism. Racism can be individual, right? But as I just said, it's also a hierarchy. And what that means is, by hierarchy, it means that we have social policies, and I'm going to be going through a slew of them here in a minute. We have social policies that allow racism to flourish and continue. It perpetuates it. It doesn't have to be something that people think about. And we're going to be talking about that at the end of all of this, when I come back around and say, why is everybody so upset about this critical race theory? Because honestly, critical race theory is about this much of Black studies. It's like this much. It can encompass pretty much all of it because all of it will fall under the umbrella. But here, I mean, it's actually kind of interesting that this one little thing has just sparked this massive backlash. But we're going to get back to that in a second. Yes, happy to do it. Racism is different from prejudice because prejudice is an attitude. Racism, right. Sure. Racism is a hierarchical social structure. What it means is that in society, not just in attitude, but in the way that we have structured policy and law, we make assumptions about people based on their race. And power, and that's the other thing, the people who normally make the decisions about giving those labels and identities are the people who are in charge, right? So they get to say who people are, thereby making normative and acceptable whatever those attitudes are. Does that make sense? Ah, that's a very good question. Racism and ethnicity would differ largely in that ethnicity has a lot more to do with culture, whereas race we would judge by just looking at somebody. In sociology, there are two master identities, sex and race. Why do you think those are the two master identities? Anybody? Yeah, you don't have to know a person. You can be walking down the street, you see somebody, those two things, you automatically will make a judgment call on what you think you know about them based on those two things. They are immediately perceivable, even though they're not always right or clear as you may think, right? Okay. And then racial prejudice, old versus new prejudice. So there's these ideas of what old prejudice is, and I'm about to go through that a little bit more. Old prejudices are the ones that were very overt, right? New prejudice is very covert, and I'm about to break down overt and covert on the next slide. Actually, let's just go there, shall we? Defining overt and covert discrimination. Overt discrimination was when law and general normative consensus said that if you are this race, this is who you are. Covert has happened since really, and I'm going to go through that, since the civil rights movement. We changed all the laws on the outside. Sometimes, a lot of them, changed a lot of them, right? Which is why people started saying, problem fixed. We're all good, right? But the ideas about who people are perpetuate. Often people are still doing the things that they weren't allowed to do, but they're doing it covertly. Okay, so let's talk about early components, overt discrimination. Overt discrimination, we would go all the way back to enslaved people. You didn't have the right to autonomy. You didn't have citizenship, no right to vote. It was illegal to be educated. You were not allowed to hold a job or make your own income. Literally no rights at all, right? Then you come into after Reconstruction. And you know, it's funny because right after that, there was the same attitude. Well, we fixed it. We're good. Everything's done. But you didn't have that, you know, so some examples of that. You had the right to educate yourself, but everything was separated out, which meant that you were getting a completely different level of education, kind of education. You have a right to have a job, but good luck getting one. You have a right to your autonomy, but many people ended up still working. It was kind of a form of like of an indentured slavery where you were given land or you were given so that you were going to pay off through work, which you were never able to do. So you never actually were able to start accumulating your own wealth. You were never able to start accumulating or building up your own wealth of any kind. Equal but separate is a way to kind of frame that whole concept of covert and overt happening at the same time. Equal, but separate. And the separate normally meant you weren't getting the best or actually access to the normative hegemonic of what we considered good. No interracial marriage. Now it's interesting, a lot of people would say there's actually a lot of religious reasons people will give for no interracial marriage. But the key to why there was no interracial marriage originally was to make sure that if someone white had a child with someone black, especially if it was a white man with a black woman, which was very common with enslaved people, that they had no ability to come back and claim any kind of rights to that person's family, their livelihood, their inheritance, or anything else. If you cannot marry, you cannot claim the name, you can't touch it. So it was just making sure that everything stayed separate. The concept of the one drop rule. Does anybody know that? Are anybody familiar with the one drop rule? The one drop rule basically says if you have one drop of any blood that is not white, you default to whatever race that blood is. That still persists today, PS, by the way. I have absolutely no problem. I have utmost respect for Obama being our first black president. I think that's great. But the fact that he is considered our first black president says that the one drop rule still holds because he had a white mother and a black father. He's just as much white as black as white, but he's the first black president. So PS, by the way, if we want to talk about like things that are still crawling around in our culture that we don't actually think about or look at, that still holds, right? Voting rights. We said you were allowed to vote, but actually people were kept from voting. They were threatened. We still today, we'll be talking about this in a minute, we still today have policies that keep people from being able to get to the ballot box and actually be part of the voting system. Education, integrated schools. But still, again, most of the schools were not equipped to allow students to really thrive. Students were not allowed to go to college. Non-white students were not allowed to go to college, so on and so forth. Then we have the civil rights movement. This is where we start getting into covert. A lot of the laws change. Things like redlining are outlawed. There's a huge push to make sure that equal opportunity is given as far as blended schools, people being able to go to college, so on and so forth. But in the meantime, not enough changes to actually see those numbers really change. So in theory, the laws have changed, but in action, society doesn't. All right, so let's talk about a little bit of what we're talking about. So I'm going to look at these four things really quickly: long-term poverty, education, school to prison pipeline, and labor market. These are some of the ways that we are seeing covert racism that's still in action today. Okay, this is a graph that shows you the probability of being poor if you are born poor. The likelihood that you will be poor into ages 20, 25, 30, and 35. As you can see, here in the middle you have white, and here down here you have African American. There is a significant number difference all the way, and in fact it increases as you get older. You have more of a chance of getting out of poverty if you're white, if you're born into it, than you do if you're black. And in a minute we're going to talk about why that is. And in fact, if we look at, this is from 2020, if you look at the ratio of proportion of poverty related to total population by race and age, this holds. In every case, in every age, by far, you are more likely to be in poverty if you are a Black American than a white American. And more so than any minority, as a matter of fact. Now, a lot of people would give different reasons for why that is. There's actually a great number of reasons. It's education. Our keynote speaker was just talking about that a little bit. It is access to jobs. But to start here, let's start with high school students. You see fewer high school students, Black high school students graduating. The difference is definitely substantial, but it's not nearly as substantial as those who end up going to college and graduating. And a lot of the reason why is because you have a greater number of people who are African American in poverty, which means that they're going to schools that do not or cannot prepare them to thrive in college. I teach college classes. I see that where I am. That's the case. People show up They don't know how to write essays. They don't know how to do these things. And I'm thinking, how is this possible? How could you get out of high school and they didn't prepare you for this? So you have people drop out. So even if they get there, they don't stay because they weren't prepared. So you have these rates. Okay. Another problem with youth being able to get out of poverty and to make headway is that you have such a huge disproportionate amount of African American children who have been imprisoned or who are in juvenile detention or some form of lockup. So during the 1980s and 2000s, there was a disproportionate amount of African American children during the Get Tough on Crime. You all remember that? What they found was you had basically the same amount of children, white children, as to Black children who got in trouble. But when you're a juvenile, the system has a choice of doing one of two things when you get in trouble. Like if you're an adult, you're going to court and you're going to jail or whatever, right? It's a straight line. If you're a juvenile, they have a choice. They can either try to send you somewhere where we catch this, we sort of nip it in the bud, and you don't get put into the system, or we can put you into the system. So what was noted was, by and large, much more often if a Black youth was involved in some kind of criminal activity, they were sent the punitive route immediately. Whereas the white student would be given a second chance or given the non-punitive route. For instance, Black youth have a case rate twice that of juveniles, 95.6 versus 46.3 per 1,000 youths who are part of this system, which is way overrepresented for the population. And this is still happening. This is from 2019, so this is 2 years old. So you have people who are, number one, in schools that are not providing the same level of education. You have more young people that are being pulled out into the criminal justice system, which puts them behind and puts them at an automatic disadvantage. And by the way, we go back to that concept of labeling, where people have an idea that you're trouble. You're already being slapped with a label that's going to work against you as you go forward. In 2010, this is a little dated, but the arrest rate ages 10 through 17 for Black youths were 9,140 per 100,000 compared to 4,236 for white. So this has been going on, and then this is just 2 years ago. So it's not changing. Now, I will say this, the rates of arrest overall for everybody is going down, but the disproportion in how races are treated is not changing. Okay, another reason that people have a hard time crawling out of poverty. Black workers are twice as likely to be unemployed as white workers at almost every education level. We always talk about, and I'm a big proponent and believer in education, 100%. I'm an educator. I do believe that education is often the way out. But if the system is stacked against you, and I just gave you some reasons why getting into high school, through high school, a good high school, and getting into college can be a problem. But let's assume you manage all that. It doesn't matter. At every single education level, unemployment is still higher. And then Black employment and skill-based underemployment are still too high. So no matter if you are in unemployment and you have a college degree, it's still higher. If you are a college graduate working in a non-college job, that's still higher. You're less likely to be able to apply your degree that you did earn. Okay, so Again, we're talking about generational poverty. I'm going to take you back to the fact that that's what we're looking at right now. That was a reminder. So that's kind of like a glimpse of the education system a little bit, right? Now let's talk about housing. Does anybody know what redlining is? We hear a lot, it's buzzword, especially hear about it around times of voting and that kind of thing. So redlining is basically the idea that we will segregate out certain areas or certain groups of people, and we will say you are too high of a risk to invest in. What does that mean? Means letting someone especially get a loan. For instance, if you come from a certain neighborhood, if you live in a certain neighborhood, if you have a certain kind of job, and often this goes hand in hand with racial differences, you can't secure a loan. Now, redlining is supposed to be illegal. And this goes back to that covert. Redlining was made illegal in the 60s. You're not allowed to do it. But you still see evidence of it happening all the time. Home ownership by race, you can see very clearly African Americans are by far less likely to be able to own their own home. And for denial rates, it is the same thing. And if looking at this particular study, the reason that you see denial rates for African Americans is largely considered, this is what they would be told, it's income to debt, which also goes back to generational poverty. Let me see. I'm going to say one thing more before I go into what we spend on pupils. But so generational poverty, there was a study that was done, and I can look it up if somebody actually wants the name. But there was a study that was done that showed people who are white normally can crawl out of poverty or get out of poverty within 3 generations. Normally, there's upward mobility. Your father does better than his father, you do better than your father, and wealth and inheritance and property is accumulated, which allows people to better themselves. That is not the case for African Americans. In fact, they did a study that showed going back 3 generations, and it's the only race in America that has this. 3 generations you can go back, and if you adjust for, all the other elements of economy, people are basically making the same amount. So again, in my mind, when you can constantly see these disparities over and over and over, generation after generation after generation, you have a problem in the system. Okay. Institutional. So we're talking about home and community right now. Home and community affects taxes, and taxes pays for what? About 36% of what? Schools. What kind of school you have, what kind of education you can get, what that school can furnish. This statement was made by a 10th grader in Philadelphia. She said, in the country schools, everything is better. Over here, we live in a ghetto. We're not getting much. So getting school funding based on property tax isn't going to do anything for the kids. And it's horrible because schools like this have a lot of kids with a lot of potential. Just because we're born in a city doesn't mean we're going to be failures, but they don't want to put in the extra effort at providing what we need for an education like calculators, computers, and so on. There are schools, even in Asheville, I lived in Asheville, North Carolina for a while, where they had one classroom shared one computer. You cannot prepare yourself for college unless you have access to computers. And that's just at school. That's before you get home, where maybe you don't have a computer at home. Maybe you don't even have electricity at home, right? So there's this undermining of the students. But in the meantime, the communities who are poor have less to invest in their schools to begin with. And what that ends up translating into is about $1,000 less per student per year in what is provided for them through their schooling. On average, 36% of total school funding comes from local property taxes, but discriminatory lending and zoning practices have a suppression on local property wealth in the communities of color, means that many are still recovering from the Great Recession. So you still have those generations all the way back who still haven't even recovered from the Great Recession in these communities. All right. And remember, we're talking about policy, right? Okay. Community. Here we have the issues of safe communities, food deserts. We're going to talk about representation and structural racism and its relationship to health. So Gordon of Tufts University, you should look at her work if you're interested in any of this. She has done a great deal of study on the relationship between Black communities and the police. And I thought this was probably a great summarization of her work. This first quote: predominant Black neighborhoods are simultaneously over-policed when it comes to surveillance and social control, and under-policed when it comes to emergency situations. Why does that matter? Well, it matters for one reason, because that's going to go back to the school to prison pipeline. So that's going to divert us right back to kids getting in trouble and getting diverted away from school, an opportunity early, disproportionate to their white peers. That's one part. The second part is just being in an unsafe community where the police aren't showing up to be of help, which can be a problem for a number of reasons. Simple as getting to school safely. It can be another reason, which is in sociology, criminology was one of my majors, and we looked at theories of crime, why people actually get involved in crime. And one of my favorite is called the innovator. The innovator means, let me back up one more second. I'm going to give you one other part of the puzzle. There's this difference between social wants and social means. Social wants are what we want because society tells us that if you are a good, successful person, you will have these earmarkers. You will have a nice car. You will have a nice house. You will have status. You will have respect. You will have these things, right? And then there's social means. We hold it out, again, going back to the Puritan ethic, that this is just you. If you can't get a hold of it, it's you, right? And you want to get a hold of it. So these are the social expectations. But social means are what you actually have available to you. Do you have in your neighborhood access to work? Do you have social ties, people who know other people that can get you work, right? They always say it's who you know, right? Do you have people in your community or in your family who can get you situated in a good place? So on and so forth. Okay, what the innovator does is the innovator says, I know I'm a good person. I know I have value and I know I have worth. I'm not going to be looked down on. If I can't get money in a legitimate, legal way, I'll get it another way. Because if I have these earmarkers, that's what defines me as good or bad, not how I get it. Which in some cases is arguably true, right? So if you are also raised in a poor community, you are more likely to be exposed to gangs. Gangs who may be selling some kind of illegal drugs or otherwise, who have what? Money, power, cars, success, respect. And it's the easy way, right? So you're exposed to that as well. You have all of these things stacked against you that's not going to allow you to get through the normative accepted channels to success. And all of this starts with the relationship between the law and the community. The second quote, from their origins in slave patrols to their active enforcement of Jim Crow to their role in the rise of mass incarceration, the police have served white interest and perpetuated anti-Blackness. Many of today's Black-white racial residential patterns reflect that emerged decades ago through discriminatory practices. Racial segregation was no accident. It was built through acts of racial violence and used in zoning laws, racial restricted covenants, and redlining, and white flight and urban renewal. And this keeps, that's the perpetuation I'm talking about. Secondly, a link between poverty and availability to food. So this study that was done showed, this was done by Johns Hopkins University Nutrition Center. And what they found out was, we all know that food deserts, does anyone not know what a food desert is? Okay, a food desert is basically a location, a community or a location that doesn't have access to healthy foods. In other words, you could go for 5, 6, 10 miles in any direction and not hit a major supermarket, right? So you don't have access to foods that are not processed, so on and so forth, right? Or maybe no food at all, other than like a corner drugstore or like a gas station or something of that nature. So that's what a food desert is. Now, the link between poverty and food deserts is well established, and everybody has always known that this is the case. But what Johns Hopkins found out was it was overly represented. You had more of a problem with that in Black neighborhoods than in any other neighborhood consistently across America. Again, if you keep seeing the same thing over and over and over, you're talking about a system. You're not talking about any one group of people. You see it all across America, right? Now, why does that matter? Why does access to food? Well, not only, for hunger, but just the sake of being fed, but it matters for any number of reasons. Health, which we're about to talk about next, just overall health of a community. It's going to matter, and this was mentioned by the keynote speaker, it's going to matter for the children. Heck, it's going to matter to the mother who's carrying the baby before the child is even born. What kind of nutrition is the mother receiving while she's actually carrying her children, right? Food is incredibly important at every single level, whether we're talking about prenatal, whether we're talking about long-term, whether we're talking about a young person who is not being fed, who can't concentrate in school, so on and so forth. So this is another system that we see just showing up pretty consistently. And then talking a little bit, this slide and the next is a little bit about representation. This slide, I know it's really hard for you to see, but you don't actually need to see all the individual things to get the basic gist. What this is a percentage of businesses that are Black owned by state. Okay. And you've got your list of states here. If you really want the PowerPoint, I can send it to you. But you don't have to look too hard to understand what this graph means. It means you don't have a large representation of Black business owners in America, period. And that goes to a lot. That goes not only to speak to entrepreneurship, the ability to afford to start your own business, the education that we already have talked about, access to the education that's going to help you become an entrepreneur and have the opportunities to become an entrepreneur. But that also means that you're not showing up in normative culture, which is very important. Does anybody know what hegemonic means? The hegemonic? Hegemonic means normative. What is normative? In America, the hegemonic, like the poster child for the hegemonic, is a white, straight, able-bodied, married, Christian male. That is the hegemonic. If you're looking for like the overall example of the American, right? And everybody else, including women, are on a stratus underneath that. What this means is that allows that norm to hold because nothing challenges it. You don't have, as the woman pointed out earlier, what's the difference between race and ethnicity? So if race is the color of your skin or your physical features, ethnicity is just important. Culture is just as important because it challenges the hegemonic. Running out of time. I knew I would. Okay, I'm going to stop talking so much. I'm going to go faster. All right. Institutional racism and power structure. This over here is the governors of all our states. Notice anything? Not one person who is African American, not one. These are the other numbers. We have one Supreme Court judge, 9.5% of circuit and district court judges, 10% of state legislators, only 1/3 of the mayors of the 100 largest cities in America, and it only goes down after that. And only 5% of sheriffs. That means people who are in power and people who represent power, again, you have this large voice of a people that is missing from culture and from the development of such. And that can be tied to lack of opportunity and so on. And then these last two, I'll go super quick. We also know that racism causes, and there are lots of studies on this, please look it up. Racism over the life course causes physical and mental harm, just living with it, right? We know that, and especially when it comes to poverty, you often hear these things about people who are in poverty, they're not good parents. They have kids that are bad, they're bad parents, or they're bad kids, or they're whatever, or they don't value education, or they don't any of these things. No, wrong. You have people who are under enormous stress that doesn't allow them to parent efficiently because maybe they're working more than one job and they're not in the home. They're under enormous depression. They have higher rates of depression, so on and so forth. Things that would affect anybody being a parent, right? But you have a concentration of it in one group, which can lead to child outcomes of poor physical health or more hyperactivity, which then gets translated in the school as troublemakers, and then you're back on the school to prison pipeline. See how it all just starts coming together. And then last, the connection between societal inequalities and health inequalities. Du Bois noted this early on. There has been lots of studies on it, but basically there are studies that show that structural racism affects both mental and physical health, and that Black Americans consistently have greater rates of infant mortality, heart disease, and cancer, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. You could keep going. And we know that this is the case because we have looked at people who are, let's step away from poverty for a second. We have looked at people, Black and white, people who are in the exact same neighborhood, exact same pay rate, all of these things have the same, basically the same resources, and you still have these health and mental disparities. There's nowhere else to go but the fact that this is the strain of racism in the system that they're living in. So why all the fuss? Why are people having such a big problem with critical race theory? Well, because, the reasons that you'll hear people say people might get upset. Well, you know what? Maybe they should. I think that's appropriate, right? I really think that when we say we shouldn't talk about things because it might upset people, it's kind of akin to like a family when you're talking about psychology. And you're talking about like a perpetrator in a family and nobody wants to say anything because you shouldn't air the dirty laundry and we shouldn't isolate this member of the family. And we don't want to upset anybody. Wrong. If you don't talk about it, nothing changes. If nothing changes, nothing changes, right? So you have to talk about it. Second, I think that there's also this idea that you hear people say, if you're in favor of talking about critical race theory, you hate your race if you're white. That's ridiculous. No, actually, it just means I believe in what this country is supposed to stand for, which is justice and equality. You should be any race and be invested in that if you're an American. It shouldn't matter, right? The other thing that people will say is that it victimizes, teaching this victimizes or paints African Americans as victims. I completely disagree. I just listed enormous barriers that this group of people have continually overcome and overcome and overcome. If anything, it is a tribute to a will to thrive and better themselves. So I think that that's ridiculous, all of those things that we hear. And I think really, honestly, if we're really talking about the real reason that people don't want to talk about it is they like the status quo the way it is, right? It's easy to just keep it going. we don't get to be covert anymore if we start talking about this. It's not going to be covert anymore. It's going to be out in everybody's face, and then things are going to have to change. And power, I've never seen anybody rush to give up power. Have you? I haven't. So you have people, I think, who are invested in not doing it. And then the last thing is people who, especially white people, who will say, but I'm not racist. If you ever get that argument, if you're talking to someone, and hopefully you will go out and talk to someone about all of this, if you get that answer, you know what? You don't have to be racist to be participating in a racist system. And that's the key. And that's really, it's a simple kind of empathy, of understanding. It's common sense, really. You know, my father was born very poor. I did not come from a wealthy family. And I can guarantee you, if I gave this lecture to him, he would be like, but I was born with nothing. Yes, Dad, you're absolutely right. But you being white was never one of the challenges. That's all. Nobody said that people who are white or who are of other races don't face challenges. They do. I'm not taking that away. But your race isn't one of them. And that's the key here. And all it takes is a little bit of empathy and educating yourself. So to talk about it is going to do a number of things. It can help us as communities. And when I say a community, I mean a community of human beings and people, because that's what we are. We are a family. We're a national family of human beings. It's going to allow others to be empowered, because knowing these things will allow them to speak knowledge to power, which is important, right? And in the long run can change policies. So my last word on this whole thing is going to be to challenge you to go out and to have this conversation. Don't shy away from it, and don't let people push it under the rug. It's important. And it's, I think it's time, don't you? So thank you for your attention today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to hand over the.
Everyone, thank you so much for being a part of today's session. I want to give you all an opportunity to ask questions. The next session between 11:30 and 12 is basically going over back upstairs to the third floor to see the vendors and all of the people that took the time to come and share information. Before you do that, any questions? And say it loud so I can repeat for the virtual.
Sure. And let me make sure that I understand first. Let me back up with the Bootstrap Theory and the Puritan work ethic. What I'm talking about is how normative society frames others. And you're absolutely right. You don't need white theory, you have your own. And I get exactly what you're saying by that. What I'm talking about is why the systems that be are allowed to perpetuate, because you have the normative society framing, making that frame and enforcing it on other people. So I totally agree. When you say self-help, can I ask you to clarify a little bit what you mean about that conversation coming in? Right. I think that that is, I mean, thank you. You're absolutely right. And I think in part, as much as I can understand, and I can't understand, and I completely, I understand that I can't understand, because I'm seeing from my own experiences. I think that for me, part of this is speaking to that, because people have to understand, number one, the history needs to be validated. That's most important. The history, it is American history. It's a part of American history people don't want to talk about, or say it's fixed, or it's over, or it's long gone, or I've got nothing to do with it. But it's American history just as much as anybody, a white person's history is history. So there's that. And in that, empowering others to be able to rise above the system, to create, because like talking about Tulsa, where you have the Black Wall Street set up and then burned to the ground. And that happens over and over. That still happens. You have, and not just, I don't think it's even just African American. You have any group of people that try to challenge the hegemonic, and they find ways to undermine it. So I think starting with acknowledging American history for what it is, so that you're empowering this generation that's coming out, getting them out from under the strains of generational poverty, which is part of addressing these inequalities within the systems. And it's interesting that you're saying, if people found out that, critical race theory is just this tiny part you see that even today. You and I were talking about how, at my own college, and I've seen it at numerous colleges, they try to do away with women's studies in the same fashion. As soon as you start making some kind of headway and it starts to get out into normative society, they're like, got to put the lid on that quick, right? And I think, I'm wondering honestly if we won't see that the more that this conversation evolves, that you won't see people trying to, though I don't think they're going to be successful. It's a Pandora's box and it's open. But I think, what's interesting, since I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, so those are the key thoughts that come up for me. Honestly, I think that as white Americans, what we need to do is one of two things. There's part of it is getting out of the way. And then part of it is like just asking, what is it that we can do? Or what is it that we should do? What is necessary other than just getting out of the way, and other than taking responsibilities for making sure that systematic racism and institutional racism is claimed and thus changed? What is our part to do? And I think that a lot, I don't know what that looks like in the Black community. In the white community, it looks like talking about this. Because it isn't, I don't think it's the Black community's job to educate the white community on this stuff. It's our job. It's our doing. Thus, it is our, I'm the one that's benefiting from it. It's my job to see it. It's my job to call it out. It's my job to talk to other whites about it. Which doesn't say that we can't have mutual conversation, but it's not the Black community's job to fix it. It's our job to fix it. So I don't know if that means that's the part of getting out of the way, but having more dialogue like we had together before, and just saying, what is necessary beyond education, beyond trying to solve the inequalities, what more is necessary? Honestly, that's as much as I would know to do, because I'm new to it. Do you have a suggestion? Do you have a thought on that? To be continued, yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I even have the mic. I appreciate all of you. Thank you all so much. If you want to connect with the speaker, if you are on the Hoover app, and I'm going to keep talking about that, please go to the Hoover app, connect with the speaker and wherever she is on social media, and anyone that you've met in the past couple of days. Our last day is tomorrow. We have a session this afternoon. Our last day is tomorrow, and I'll see you guys again. Bye.